All right. Well, we're going to start our Bible survey tonight in Genesis chapter 20 with a story of Abraham and a man named Abimelech. Now, there are three similar stories that take place in the book of Genesis. We've already looked at one of them. You may notice that this is something that, as we get into this story, you might think, didn't I hear this already? Because Abraham has done this already before. And we'll get into another story later, very similar. I can't remember if it's the same Abimelech or not, but anyway, you'll see as I get into the story what I'm talking about. So while Abraham was traveling through the wilderness, he encountered a man named Abimelech of Ger, who was a Philistine king. And you see the map on the screen behind me. There's a little red, what is that, point? I don't know. I was going to say dot, but it's got a point on the bottom. Yeah, a little "you are here" marker. And that'll tell you roughly the area we're talking about when I say Gerar. And these are some places that are going to be familiar with you probably from the news right now. There's Jerusalem, if you have trouble seeing it. There's Jerusalem right there. The Dead Sea. Over here is the Gaza Strip, what we know as the Gaza Strip today, and Egypt. So we're kind of down in this area near the Gaza Strip is the area of Gerar. And this is, if not the first, it's one of the first mentions of the Philistines in Scripture, all the way back there. And one of their kings there in Gerar was a man named Abimelech. And when Abraham encountered Abimelech, he had already been worried about this as he was traveling through the Philistine lands and had got to thinking, you know, Sarah's a pretty attractive woman, especially for 90. And if they find out that she's my, you know, they may just want to have her. And if they find out she's my wife, they may kill me to get her. Again, I don't understand this thought process. But he says, I'm worried that a Philistine is going to kill me and take Sarah as a wife. He's worried about this. You'll see in verses 1 and 2. So he comes up with a plan because this worked out oh so well before. And in verse 2 we see it says, Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. So this is what happened with Pharaoh. I don't know why he didn't come up with another plan to try to avoid getting killed and also avoid having his wife taken, but it seems not to have bothered him. And Sarah was, as we discussed last time, probably his half-sister. This is before God had introduced some of the prohibitions on those kinds of relationships. And so she was probably his half-sister and his wife. This is the sort of thing that we're trying to teach my kids. As we say, don't lie, don't lie, don't lie. Well, they've figured out, well, I can just not tell the entire truth. So what we've started telling them is, no, you were being deceptive. Don't be deceptive. Because you're technically not lying, but you left out an important part of the story, all right? When he said to Abimelech, Sarah is my sister, he's not lying, but he left out an important part of the story. He was being deceptive. So he deceived Abimelech, said Sarah was only his sister when she was really both that and his wife. And so Abimelech took her into his harem, I guess. And God came to Abimelech in a dream by night. This is interesting. He comes to Abimelech with a warning. And I don't know why, but I just love the bluntness of his warning. He says here in verse 3, in this dream that he appears to Abimelech in, he says, indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. God doesn't just say, you know what, you've made a mistake. Doesn't just say, oh, I'm sorry, you were lied to. He said, you are a dead man. If God came to you in a dream and said, you're a dead man, that would get your attention, right? I think that's probably what God's intention was there. So he came to him in this dream. He warned Abimelech not to marry Sarah because she was already married to Abraham. And so Abimelech pleads with God for mercy. And part of his plea was, I haven't touched her. I haven't done anything. I haven't even been anywhere near her. And this again tells us this is a totally different world than the one we live in. He's marrying this woman that he may have just seen from afar. They have shows about this on TLC. I think I've never watched them, but I've seen the commercials, and it just puzzles me. These people that they're getting married and they're seeing each other, meeting for the first time on their wedding day. But that's how this was. So God said, you're in deep trouble here. He says, I haven't been anywhere near her. Please, can we talk about this? And he said, I'm innocent in the matter. I've been lied to. My people certainly haven't done anything to deserve the destruction that's going to come on them. And so God said, basically, you haven't touched her. Keep it that way. Return her to Abraham. Now, who is at fault? I know to us it seems crazy that Abimelech would marry somebody without taking the time to get to know her, but that's the way they did in ancient cultures. So who's really at fault in all of this? Abraham. Not only has he sold his wife out twice, but he has now endangered this man. He's nearly caused this man to commit a terrible sin of adultery. And yet for some reason Abraham comes out well in this again. Abimelech returned Sarah, and he confronted Abraham about his deceitful behavior. He says, you lied to me. You didn't tell me the full truth. And look at what you almost caused to happen. Look at the great calamity that you brought on me. He said, you've nearly destroyed me, because all you told me was that she was your sister. And Abraham answered him, when he says, why have you done this? Abraham's answer was, well, I didn't know what was going to happen. I was afraid they were going to kill me. She really is my sister, so I didn't lie to you. I just left out that important piece of information. Now, it says in verse...
You don't think Abraham was very brave, was it?
Doesn't seem to be.
He's a coward.
Yeah, does not seem to have been very brave. At times. And this is again, I think some of the importance of Abraham's story is that he has these incredible moments of trust in God, these mountaintops, and in between them are these valleys that we just look at him and say, what are you thinking? And but I think his stories are more dramatic probably than the events in our lives, but they're probably more like the way we live our lives than we would care to admit. Because I think a lot of us have these mountaintops, these moments where I trusted God, did what I was supposed to, and then right after it is this valley where I just messed that up. I didn't listen to God. But yeah, he seems to have not been able to sustain bravery.
Sarah had a chance too to make it right, but she said, he's my brother.
Oh, okay. Yes, Sarah had a chance to make it right. She went along with the deception.
Yeah.
So she's partly at fault here too. By the way, I was told a few weeks ago, hey, we can hear something. Whatever you're doing differently, we can hear great now. We can hear everything that goes on. Great. So I kind of just left the discussion as is, but I found out this week some people are still having trouble. They said, I love what you're doing on Wednesday nights, but I can't hear what they're saying. So I haven't lost my mind when I'm repeating back to you what you're saying. I'm doing it for the people in the box. So anyway, yes, she had the opportunity to make it right and said, this is just, he's just my brother. So when Abraham came to him, when Abraham admitted what had gone on, Abimelech, it says in verse 14, took sheep, oxen, and male and female servants and gave them to Abraham, and he restored Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, see, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you. Then to Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. Indeed, this vindicates you before all who were with you and before everybody. And thus she was rebuked. Wait a minute. He says, I've given your family 1,000 pieces of silver and told you you can go wherever you want. And that's your punishment. Oh, please punish me.
Yeah, right.
Why in the world did Abimelech respond this way? What kind of consequence is this?
Well, God told him in the dream, if you don't restore her back to Abraham, you're a dead man.
Okay. God had already told him in the dream, you've got to send her back or you're in trouble. But why did he not just send her back and say, y'all get out of my country?
He's going to make sure that he did restored her properly so
Okay.
he didn't get killed.
Okay. He's going to make sure he did it the right way. I've suspected too that there's a part of him that just says, here, please take whatever you want and just leave me alone. And somebody that serves a God like that he's afraid of, even though Abraham wasn't necessarily on the right side of God at that moment, he's probably thinking, I don't want to mess with you or your God. Just take it all and leave me alone.
I have a couple of thoughts.
Okay.
First of all, if you go on and read verses 17 and 18, it says that apparently Abimelech's family and servants and everyone were like Sarah. They were not able to have babies. And your question was, why did Abimelech do all of this?
Mm-hmm.
And I think back in verse 7, it gives us the answer to that. It says, now therefore, restore the man's wife, for he's a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. And so Abimelech probably thought, okay, maybe the reason he wanted Sarah in the first place was because his own wife and family, harem, couldn't produce babies.
Mm-hmm.
He thought, okay, here's an outsider. We'll get some new blood in here and see what happens.
That's good.
And then when God threatened
Sounds
him,
good to me.
God said, he thought, not only should I restore her, but I should make sure that Abraham knows that I want his good favor because of his Lord and because of his God.
That's a good point. That's one of those details that's easy to miss in all the stuff going on. If you look at verse 18, and I'll come back and say what he said, what Jack said, but verse 18, the Lord had closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So God had afflicted, as Jack pointed out, had afflicted them with barrenness, with infertility. And it said, you said verse 7, now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, and all who are yours. So it wasn't just Abimelech. It was his entire bloodline that ran the risk of being wiped out. So Jack raised the point that he wanted to stay in Abraham's good graces so he could be prayed for and be healed, as the Lord had told him. So a lot of stuff going on here. And I want to believe that Abraham would not have said, I got rich off of this scam the first time. I would like to believe that that's not the reason why he did all this again. When I lied to Pharaoh, he had to return my wife, and I got stuff out of it. But we don't see record of Abraham doing this a third time. So hopefully that's not his reason. But
There's another thing. God spoke to Abimelech, and we're assuming that he was not a godly person.
We would assume, yeah.
So you can be assured that God still does that, speaks to the unsaved,
He can.
if they would only listen.
Yeah, he can. It's a good point. Yeah, Abimelech was, we have no reason to think otherwise than that he was a worshiper of the Philistine gods, and yet God spoke to him. He just happened to be listening. Yeah. All right. And sometimes the pagans in these stories are listening more than those who are followers of God.
Yeah. I like that.
Which is, it's a sad thing when that happens, but it's a reminder to us. So he offered Abraham these lavish gifts and gave him permission to settle anywhere he pleased in Abimelech's kingdom. So y'all have any more questions about that or comments on that story? All right. And we will go on to the birth of Isaac. And as big an event as this is, there's really not a lot of action to go through here with you in just the birth. You know how this works. Birth. Genesis chapter 21, verse 2 tells us that Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. So God had told him, all this time, this is going to happen, you're going to have descendants. He assumed it was going to be through somebody he adopted. God said, no, it's going to be your actual biological children. Years go on, and he says, well, maybe I'm supposed to have a child with the maid. God says, no, it's not that child. It's going to be a child with your wife. And years go on through this process, and finally God says to him, all right, it's going to happen. It's going to be just like I said it was going to be, and it's going to be within a year. So God finally gave him a time frame, and then just like God said would happen, Sarah became pregnant with this child. At the age of 90, Sarah finally gave birth to a healthy baby boy named Isaac. And Abraham had Isaac circumcised on the 8th day as God had commanded. They went through all of the rituals they were supposed to do. And Sarah talks about the fact that she had laughed when she had heard this, that she was going to give birth. As I think that many of us would laugh at that idea, would think that was crazy.
I would cry if I had a baby at 90. There was no laughing matter.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, yeah. I've said before that I can feel the difference in every 10 years. I remember it was 10 years ago Benjamin was born, and I remember how much energy I had at 25 versus how much energy I have now at 35. And I know y'all are saying, oh, cry me a river. But compared to what it was at 25, and now with all of these more children, I'm a lot more tired than I was 10 years ago.
Yes.
I think I'd be crying at 45 if I found out there was a baby on the way. There's a reason God gives them to us when we're young and foolish. And
also doesn't give you more than you can handle.
I don't know that that's true. I've heard people say that God doesn't give you more than you can handle. I don't see that in Scripture unless we're talking about temptation. I see that He doesn't give us more than He can handle. But some of the stuff God has asked people to do is way beyond their capability. And sometimes we were talking beforehand about my day with Charlie yesterday. Makes me wonder if that's true, that God doesn't give you more than you can handle. So I don't know.
We give you more than you can handle on your own.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And by the time I got him home yesterday and was talking about my day, Charla was just smiling and laughing because that's her day every day. And it wasn't her yesterday. So anyway, but she laughed. She laughed at the concept of being her age and having a baby. And now here it was. God does the impossible. God does the improbable. God does the things that we think that could never happen. But if God says He's going to do it, He's going to do it. Now, unfortunately, there were problems. God had fulfilled His promises, but it didn't mean that everything was just hunky-dory in their house, or tickety-boo, as we say in our house. I don't know why. We heard that on a program somewhere, and apparently it's an old British thing, but it just stuck. So, everything was not wonderful because of their previous trying to run ahead of God and say, well, God, you couldn't do this, so we're going to fix it, where Abraham had Ishmael with Hagar. Genesis 21:9 says, Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. So there was some sibling rivalry going on, just as there had kind of been some rivalry between the wives, or between the wife and the mistress. I was going to say baby mama, but yeah, to use today's terminology. So as thankful as they were for God's provision that He would send Isaac in this miraculous way, there were problems. As Isaac grew, his older half-brother Ishmael became jealous. That sometimes happens when there's a new baby, but it didn't help the fact that there was some obvious favoritism and some balance of power issues between the mothers. And so he became very jealous of Isaac. He mocked Isaac and he treated Isaac badly. Now, what are you going to do when you see your child being treated badly, especially at home? Is that going to make you happy? Somebody else's child treats them badly? There was once upon a time a little kid was being mean to Madeline in the play place at Chick-fil-A. And Papa Grizzly came out and Charla had to say, you got to stop. You can't go in there and do that. That's somebody else's child. You know, I was going to go whoop on him. You can't do that to other people's children unless you want to go to jail. Now, fortunately, Madeline, by the time I got around the corner, she had the kid in a headlock. It was just pounding on him. So she took care of it. But we see, she's about Charlie's age at the time this happened. But when we see our kids being treated badly by somebody else's kids, there's an instinct that comes out. Now, when it's home, it's just my kids. I've about made a rule, come very close to making a rule that anybody can do anything to anybody older than them, because of the way they tend to all treat their younger siblings. But when it's somebody else's kid, you know, I'll sit back and just watch my kids pound on each other if they need to. But somebody else that's not one of them steps in and treats my kid badly, this instinct wells up in me. We all have it, that mama bear, papa bear instinct. And Sarah, understandably, was upset to watch this little snot-nosed kid pick on Isaac. And she wasn't having it. She was upset by Ishmael's behavior toward Isaac, so much so that she insisted on Abraham throwing Hagar and Ishmael out of their home. She said, they've got to go. They've got to go. And Abraham struggled with this. Abraham wasn't thrilled by this. He didn't want to send the two away. For whatever reason, he didn't come and put his foot down, though, and tell her no. But he agonized over the decision. How do I get out of this? My first thought is, tell somebody she's just your sister. That seems to work in every other situation. but he struggles with it. And finally, God told him, it's okay. If you send them away, I'm going to take care of them. I've made the promise to you through Isaac, and so that's what needs to take priority, but I will also take care of them also. So God clarified to Abraham that his promises to Abraham would be fulfilled through Isaac. However, he said for Abraham's sake, he would also bless Ishmael greatly. You know, God has enough blessings in store that he can bless more than one person. And he said, yes, Isaac is the son of promise. Isaac is ultimately the fulfillment of my promises, not Ishmael. But I'm going to bless Ishmael also for your sake. He says in verse 13, yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. He says he's your son too. And so he's going to get a share of the blessings. Now, this is backwards from the way it usually works. And we're going to see this theme throughout the book of Genesis. Actually, we'll see this theme throughout the Old Testament and into the New, of God doing things backwards from the way people expected. Because the firstborn tended to be favored in the ancient world. As a matter of fact, I've heard that maybe in the Israelite culture, but in some cultures, the firstborn might get 2 shares of the inheritance, or even half the inheritance. So it might be a circumstance where, say, like my family, we're going to have 5 kids, where you divide the pot of the inheritance into 6 and give Benjamin 2 shares, and everybody else gets 1/6 of it. Or Benjamin would just get half of it, and the other 4 would split the other half. That's how it worked in a lot of ancient cultures. And we even see sometimes the firstborn in the Israelite culture rebelling against this idea that God is going to favor the second. Why do you think that? Why would God orchestrate these events like this
Isaac was a promise of God, Ishmael was not.
Right,
Ishmael was, it was Sarah's
right,
fault.
right. But, and that's true. That's absolutely correct. She said that God did this because Isaac was the son of promise. That's what God said. But this is not the only time this happens, and we're going to get into some of these stories later. But we see other circumstances where God picks the second child over Jacob and Esau being a prime example.
Yeah.
I'm drawing a blank offhand. Joseph, who was way far down. Yeah.
Yeah.
But why? And this is not a test. I mean, I'm not going to zap you for wrong answers. We haven't gone over this yet. I'm just wondering if you see any reason why God doesn't emphasize the firstborn the way they expect him to all the time.
Because they expect it.
Okay, because they expect it.
Well, he looks at
He
the
will
heart.
do the unexpected.
He'll do the
He
unexpected.
looks at the heart of the person, not the order that they're born in.
Okay.
It's because you see David as king and Jacob and said it.
Right.
And he's looking at what they're made out of.
Right.
What they're doing toward him,
Right,
rather than their birthplace.
right. Okay. And that's, I mean, you brought up David. And David wasn't the second born, but he was down the line. And that the quote that you kind of referenced there, I don't know if you quoted it directly, but that comes from the discussion about David, that God doesn't look on the outward appearance as man does, but he looks inward at the heart. That's when Jesse, I believe it was saying, David as king, really? And Samuel said, no, God looks at this differently. Or maybe God said that to Samuel. I have to go back and refresh my memory there. But that's from that story. That's part of it. I think part of it, too, is to remind Israel that even as they are God's chosen people, as this vessel to bring the Messiah into the world, God's also going to have a second-born, which would be the Gentiles that he brings in through Jesus Christ. We can get into that discussion a little more, but I think a lot of these things work together, and from the very first pages of Genesis, God has already shown us things that are going to point to Jesus Christ. Yes, sir.
The commentary of my Bible says that there were, at the time of Abraham, legal codes among society, if you will. Specifically points out the code of Nuzi and the code of Hammurabi. And it may be that these were the customs, laws, whatever you want to call them, the codes that people were living by that were man-made.
Yeah.
And God was maybe saying, I don't operate by your laws, I operate by mine.
That's a good possibility too. I like that. That would be a way of God saying, God looking at these things like the code of Hammurabi. I've heard of that one, not the other one you mentioned. You say Nuzi?
Yeah, capital N-U-Z-I.
Okay, I'm going to look that up. Nuzi. But there were these legal codes in place, and God was saying, I don't operate according to your law. I operate according to mine. God can be doing. God is so smart. The word smart doesn't even feel right to apply to God because it's so much deeper than that. But God's playing 5-dimensional chess, right? He can be doing multiple things at one time and then bring it all together. So it can be any number of these things that he was trying to accomplish. Any more thoughts on that? On any
It
of that?
started off that way because of Cain, Abel, and Seth.
Mhm.
Seth got named the blessing.
Yes, yeah,
And he had to be the third son.
Yeah.
So it started in the beginning.
started very early. Yeah, that's good. That's another example. Cain and Abel and Seth. All right. I wasn't sure if we'd get to this tonight, but it looks like we will. So the last one I have in my notes for tonight is in Genesis chapter 22. God provides a sacrifice. And in verse 1, it says, it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham. Now, tell you sometimes here's what we know and here's what we don't know. What we do know is that God didn't test Abraham for God to find out anything about Abraham.
You already knew.
God already knew, absolutely. That's what I do know, is that God was not in doubt. And I have some thoughts on why then would God test Abraham. But what do you think might have been the reason for God to test Abraham?
Abraham was able to trust God.
Okay. Abraham was able to trust God.
That's what the commentary on the Bible says. This was not a temptation,
Mhm.
but rather God was examining Abraham's heart.
Mhm. But again, not for God to find out anything, because he already knew. But for Abraham, okay. The verb that's translated here as tested is a verb that often means to prove the quality of. So it's not necessarily, as I said, it's not that God was trying to say, well, is Abraham up to the test? I don't know. Let's find out. It was God testing it to put it on display to prove this faith that he had already seen in Abraham. I think probably to prove it to Abraham, to prove it to Abraham's descendants, to prove it to a watching world that Abraham really was a man of faith, a man who believed God, even when it was at its most difficult. Because here's what he did. He didn't just test Abraham on something that he could take or leave. He goes for the one thing that Abraham wanted more than anything, the one thing that Abraham has waited for longer than anything, the one thing that Abraham had to believe God in more than anything, because there was nothing Abraham could do to fulfill the promise himself, and he tried, but ultimately he had to trust God. He tested Abraham's faith, proved Abraham's faith when it came to his son. And
Abraham had to remember the promise that God made that his lineage would be more than the stars.
Right. Yeah.
He already told Abraham that.
Yeah.
And to kill Isaac would negate God's promise.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew Isaac was he knew in his heart that God would not let him sacrifice Isaac.
Yeah. It's
I
true.
believe.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. And she said that he had to remember God's promise that God was going to make his descendants through Isaac as numerous as the stars in the sky, and to kill Isaac would have negated that. So she believes that he believed that God had a plan in place, that God was still going to, and we see that. I think it's in Hebrews chapter 11 talks about Abraham believing that God, if I sacrifice him here, God's just going to raise him. And so
You can tell in this verse, because in verse 5, he tells his servants, we will return.
Yeah.
We will come back.
That's good. That's another detail easy to miss. Verse 5 says, he tells the servants, we will come back to you. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. He knew God was up to something, he just didn't know what.
Right.
There are times though, unless I'm alone in this, that it is difficult for us to trust God, even though we know he's got this track record of faithfulness, even though we know he always keeps his promises. When he calls us, especially when it's with that thing that we cling to, that it's hard to remember that and be willing to let go and trust God in it. And I'm kind of like Abraham in this regard. It's my children. You know, you can set a lot of things wrong in my world, and I'm going to be all right. I have low blood pressure. Charla asked me the other day, why aren't you as upset about this as I am? I said, because I'm not as upset about anything as you are. You know, I'm pretty laid back until something happens with my kids. And part of that is, you know, my father-in-law talks about Paul's shipwreck in the book of Acts and how he grabbed hold of the the broken pieces and floated to shore. And there was a point in my life where I felt like my kids were the broken pieces. They were all I had to cling to. They were the only reason I'd get up in the morning. And so for a few years, it was just the three of us. And so I'm very attached to my kids. So in those circumstances where I'm saying, God, it would work better this way if you just do what I'm asking and do what I'm telling you. And God makes me wait. And he says, no, I've got this in mind. It's really hard to trust, even though I know God's taken care of every bit of it before. You know, and so I get it. And then how Abraham just so willingly goes along with it. This test, for those watching at home, we haven't even really said what the test was if you're not familiar with it. God told Abraham to take Isaac, who was now a young man, to Mount Moriah and offer him a sacrifice. Now, as a sacrifice. Now, the reason I think he was a young man is because he said, here's the wood. Help me carry it up the mountain.
My study said he was approximately 15 years old.
Possibly, yeah. I was guessing at least 10 to 12, so 15's at least 10 to 12. He said in verse 2, now take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. Again, probably a young man. He's old enough to have an understanding and a conversation with his father about what they're doing and about where the sacrifice is. He's old enough to carry the wood up the hill, and I'm just now in a place where I will let Benjamin help me with outdoor work, because before he wanted to help, but he wasn't helpful. He wasn't strong enough to do much. And so I figure he's at least that age. God said, go up the mountain, and what we see is, even though it was difficult, even though God was asking him to do something that I think all of us would look at and say, you want me to what? Abraham didn't hesitate. He got up early the next morning and prepared to make the journey. Verse 3 says, he rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took off took two of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. And you have those things that you dread doing and you think, I'm not going to leave the house until I absolutely have to. I would think that would be how you'd do this. But Abraham, for all his moments of fear, for all his moments of cowardice that we've talked about, he seems to have no doubt in his mind that God's going to take care of this. God's got this. So they head off up the mountain early in the morning. It's apparently a multi-day journey, because it says, then on the third day, this is starting in verse 4, then on the third day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the two of them went together. But Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And then he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, my son, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. Now, I don't think Abraham knew what was going to happen next. It's possible that when he said God will provide, that he's looking at the burnt offering God has already provided. Because God provided that son, and now he was going to have to offer that son back to God, believing that God was going to raise him up from the dead, believing that God was going to do something still to fulfill his promises. But man, still, the amount of faith and obedience it took, I cannot get over the amount of faith and obedience it took throughout this story. Even knowing that your son's going to be okay and God's going to raise him up, God's going to do whatever. I don't know how he still went through this. When I have to do surgery on one of the kids' feet to get a splinter out, it just kills me to see them in pain, even though I know they're going to be okay on the other side of it. I can't imagine having to plunge the dagger in, or think you're going to have to plunge the dagger in and put them through that, even knowing that it's going to be okay on the other side. I thought somebody started to say something. Somebody have a comment or question? Okay. So,
It doesn't, in this scripture, it doesn't say anything about how Isaac reacted when his father bound him and put him on the, it doesn't say anything about it.
Right.
Or what he may have felt.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Doesn't say anything about how Isaac reacted. And you know, if he's big enough to carry the wood, he's big enough to fight back, especially against a 100-year-old man.
Yeah.
But he doesn't seem to have. He must have had incredible trust in his father too.
Well, I'm sure his father had told him. I'm sure he's well aware of God and who God is.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
Abraham's already taught him that.
Yeah.
But to have as much faith as Abraham has,
Mhm.
it's only 15.
Yeah.
You know, I wonder if, and this could create more faith in him.
Yeah.
This-
Well, yeah, I think you come out on the other side of something like this going, okay, there's nothing God can't do. As much as I would like for it to have been, as much as I would like the journey of faith to have always been an easy thing, in the times when I feel well taken care of and everything's great, those are not the times that I've grown spiritually. It's always been through those times that I'm going, gee, I'm glad that's over with.
Yeah. It's the hard times is
Yeah.
when you develop your faith, I believe.
Yeah. So I think they would have come out on the other side of this going, okay, now we really know there's nothing that God can't do. So, Abraham built an altar, starting in verse 9, there, and placed the wood in order, and he bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. So once they had arrived at that appointed spot, Abraham built this altar, he arranged the wood, he bound Isaac, and the very last thing is he reluctantly, raises his knife to fulfill God's command by sacrificing his son. And there was a voice at that precise moment, an angel of God called out and stopped him, called him by name. He said, "Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Now, the angel of the Lord,
I think that's Jesus.
I've wondered the same thing because, well, let's see if it's the same reason.
Which in the Old Testament, it's angel of the Lord, because the name Jesus doesn't come into being until the New Testament.
Right. Right. And I've told you before, angel, the word angel just means messenger. Now there is a class of created spirit beings that we think of as angels. The Bible calls them cherubim and seraphim. But even in Revelation, it uses the word angel of the churches, and it's referring to probably the pastors. And we're not angels. It means a messenger. And so sometimes when you see messenger of the Lord in the Old Testament, it can be referring to the pre-incarnate Christ, what we call a Christophany. And we'll talk about that some on Sunday morning. Just give you a little taste of Sunday morning. But I've wondered if this might be one of those instances where it's not one of those spirit beings, it's Jesus, because the angel says, "You fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." Well, he wasn't making an offering to an angel. He was making the offering to God. And if that's the case, then we're talking about Jesus, the actual sacrificial lamb, being here. There's just a lot to ponder here. As far as him saying, "Now I know that you fear God," I don't think that means that Jesus didn't know it before, or that God didn't know it before. I think it's just it's describing the way he had now put it on display. It's apparent to everybody that you fear God. So he looks up, and behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And I've seen pictures of some of these thickets of thorns in that part of the world, and they're not anything I want to get tangled up in. But I've also seen a ram, okay? And there's a reason why Dodge calls their trucks after these animals. They don't call it the Dodge Squirrel, because they want to have a picture of they want you to have the idea of a strong animal. These rams are pretty tough. And so the idea of it getting caught by its horns where it can't get out, I'm thinking that in and of itself is miraculous, that they're going to find this big tough animal caught in these plants. And I think they had to have realized that it was God's provision. And so they offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. So it was the sacrifice that God had provided. And then God commended Abraham for his faithfulness, and he reaffirmed his promises to multiply Abraham's descendants like the stars of the heaven or the sand on the shore. And I thought, just as a way to finish this up tonight, I'm looking at the time, we'll do it quickly. A way to finish this up tonight, we talk about some of the comparisons between when God told you, you offer your son, and when God offered his son. Because I think this is one of those examples of pointing forward to what Jesus was going to do. Not that Abraham had to go through with it, but God's setting a precedent here. He said in verse 2, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love. John 3:16, we know that this is what God actually did. He gave up his only begotten son. Now you'll see some translations, his one and only son. I don't know that that's wrong, but I don't think that's the best way to translate it, because the Bible says that we are adopted as sons and daughters of God in Jesus Christ. So technically he's not God's only son, but he's God's only begotten son. He's the only son who is also God. So for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. He only has one. And he offered his son just like Abraham was being called to offer his.
I think God was making a point with Abraham, because there are 3 times that he said, your only son.
Very good.
Isaac, in verse 2, verse 12, and verse 16.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that it was, he used that phrase 3 times. Your only son. Yeah. One of the things, and I didn't follow my own rules here, but one of the things I teach when I teach how to conduct Bible study is one of the things you want to look for is when God repeats something. Because if God says it once, it's important. If he takes the time to say it twice in a passage, you're probably looking at something really important. And so for him to say 3 times, your only son, I don't think that's coincidence at all. I think you're right. He's making a point. So he says in verse 2, offer him there as a burnt offering. Now we talked Sunday morning about the burnt offering. And why would, you may not remember. You may not. What was the purpose of the burnt offering? Do you remember? What did you say?
Is it for sin?
For sins, yeah. It wasn't a trick question. Now there was also sin offering. There were some that were for unintentional sins. But burnt offering was to presumably to pay for your sins. So he says you're going to offer this as at least a temporary payment for sin. And then in Hebrews 10:10, in one of the verses we looked at on Sunday, he says we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ. He was the offering for our sins. He was the one-time offering for our sins. That was if you slept through it, that was the main point of my message Sunday morning, that no other sacrifice was needed ever because of what Jesus accomplished one time. All right, just a couple more of these. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. So Isaac had to carry what was to be the instrument of his own execution up the hill. And we look at John 19, and it says, and Jesus, bearing his cross, went out to a place called the place of the skull. Jesus also had to carry his own instrument of execution up the hill. I borrowed some of these from somebody else. I can't take credit for them being original. Genesis 22:7 says, Isaac asks, where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Well, this is compared with John 1:29, where John the Baptist says, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. There are a few more of these. If you spend some time looking at Genesis 22, you'll find lots of parallels where I think this is just one of many times. I could have done a Sunday morning sermon on this in this current series. This is just one of many times when God is using something in the Old Testament that will point, kind of be a hint, a foreshadowing of what he's going to do in the New Testament.